no one ever dared ask me who I really was, because everyone, press, advisors, modern subjects, had already decided for me. Celeste Aldridge, the princess with impeccable posture, educated in Swiss boarding schools, always armed with a prepared speech about duty, honor, and tradition. A woman crafted to be a symbol, not a human. But what none of them knew, or perhaps even suspected, was that for years I repeated that name like a memorized role. And every night, before sleep, a question burned behind my closed eyes. What if all this was nothing but a carefully tailored disguise? The memory came like a whisper that never fully faded, a scent, lavender and smoke, a soft song, unlike those I heard at palace galas, and a lap, someone calling me by another name. I tried to ignore it. I tried to silence the memory with engagements, red carpets, and smiles that didn't belong to me. But that day, at a monotonous, predictable ceremony like so many others, I saw something. An antique brooch pinned to the dress of a woman I didn't recognize. A small golden object adorned with bluish-gray stones. But it was the way it caught the light that froze me. It wasn't the brooch itself, but what it awakened. My heart raced with a kind of fear that didn't come from outside, but from within, as if a forgotten piece of my past had clicked into place without permission. While everyone around clapped and exchanged greetings, I stood still, smiling with my lips, but waging a silent battle within. I knew. I just knew. It wasn't a coincidence. And that woman wasn't a stranger. The brooch was the key to something my parents, or those who raised me, swore would never surface. And in that moment, everything I believed myself to be began to crumble with a treacherous delicacy, not in shouts, but in silence. The kind of silence that precedes a devastating truth. What followed was a performance, and I, as always, remained center stage. I greeted guests, curtsied at the right moment, let the camera flashes swallow me. But inside something had shifted, and there was no going back. I spent the entire night replaying that image in my mind. The brooch, the woman, the way she averted her gaze when she realized I was watching. It wasn't fear. It was sadness. A deep, restrained sadness, like someone recognizing something they could never claim. When I was finally alone, locked in my chambers with the curtains drawn and my dress hanging, I slipped off my shoes slowly and stood barefoot on the cold floor. I looked in the mirror. The makeup still flawless, the hair still in place, the princess the world knew, unshakable. But my eyes, they no longer lied. I stared at them for long minutes, searching for an answer. The problem is, when you live a lie for too long, it starts to stick to your skin. It starts to blend with who you are. I knew I wouldn't sleep. Something was pulsing inside me, an urgency I'd never felt before. I retrieved an old box, tucked away in the back of a wardrobe. Inside were a few childhood mementos, letters, photos, a child's necklace with a dull stone, and a note. No date, no signature, a shaky, brief handwriting. She has his eyes. Promise you'll protect her, at any cost. I'd read that note so many times I knew every letter by heart. But that night it carried a new weight. Who was he? Who had written it? Why was everything always cloaked in half-truths? As a child, they told me I was sent to boarding school early for safety, that the media was cruel, that protecting my childhood was a priority. But now I was beginning to understand. What they wanted to protect was the secret. I returned to the image of the woman with the brooch. I needed to know who she was. It became an almost physical necessity, like breathing. The next morning, before the palace fully woke, I discreetly summoned my personal assistant. one of the few not bound to the inner circle imposed by the Aldrich House's PR team. Matthew, I need a name. That woman. From yesterday's ceremony, she was wearing a golden brooch. He looked at me for a second, hesitating, but something in my tone stopped him from refusing. He nodded, and there in that moment, with a simple phrase spoken softly, I crossed an invisible line. From then on, everything I knew would no longer be enough, because what I was about to uncover didn't belong to the world of appearances. It belonged to my blood. Matthew returned 2 days later. All that time, while I smiled for cameras and made public appearances alongside figures who pronounced my name like a title, not an identity, I waited, pretending, waiting, swallowing questions like someone learning to survive hunger. When he finally entered the room where I was rehearsing a speech on youth and culture, one look was enough. He said nothing in front of the others, just slipped an envelope among my papers as if it were just another agenda item. But my hands trembled as I touched it. I waited until I was alone to open it. A name, a photo, a brief, discreet history pulled from public records few would bother to access. Eleanor Grace Norwood, 62 years old, retired nurse, former social worker at a private clinic in Connecticut. No mention of royal connections, no link, at least formally, to my family. But seeing her image, the slightly curved eyes, the subtle line between her brows, I felt something stir inside me, as if my body recognized before my mind could accept. I knew I'd have to see her, alone, no security, no protocol. I also knew that if anyone found out, there'd be no explaining it. And still, I went. I used a false name, plain clothes, hair, tied back so no one would notice. Matthew helped. He didn't ask questions, he just drove. When Eleanor opened the door, she hesitated. Time seemed to stop. She didn't say princess. She didn't kneel or feign surprise. She just looked at me with teary eyes and whispered, "You came." I didn't understand how she knew, or why. All I knew was that those words broke me. I wanted to pull back, to keep intact the wall that had protected me since childhood. But her voice was warm, human, familiar in a way I couldn't explain. "I remember you as a little girl. I remember how you cried when they took you away." My throat closed. "Took me away from who?" I asked, even though I wasn't ready to hear. She looked at me with pain, a pain that seemed aged but never overcome. "From your mother." There was no fanfare, no staged grand revelations. Just that. A simple woman holding a piece of truth no one had ever given me. I wanted to deny it. I screamed inside. How could this be real? How, if my birth certificate said otherwise? If my father, the one who always called me daughter, loved me in his rigid, calculated way? But Eleanor had proof. A hospital bracelet, a card with my name, another name. An old, faded photo of a young woman with my same eyes holding a baby. And on the back, a phrase in trembling letters, "She is my light. May she never be forgotten." I held that photo like someone holding a life they never got to live. And in that moment I understood. I was a symbol, yes, a princess, molded to fit an empire of traditions and lies. But before that, I was someone's daughter, someone who loved me, someone erased from history so another could be written in her place. And now, I knew. And knowing in my world was far too dangerous. After that day, everything I thought solid began to feel fragile. The ground beneath my feet was no longer marble, it was paper. And I walked on it like someone afraid there. Steps might tear the lie holding their story together. I returned to the palace with the serene face they taught me to keep. I smiled for photographers, waved to drivers, answered questions about culture and diplomacy, with the same polished tone as always. But inside, a quiet fire was burning everything. Didn't speak to Eleanor again, not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to understand who I was outside her presence. I needed to hear my own voice amid the noise. I spent nights digging through private archives, accessing old hospital records from where I was supposedly born. The dates didn't add up. The names did, but they were tied to generic, cold details, as if someone had stitched a new story together, in haste to erase the old one. It was in this search that his name resurfaced, Liam Hart, an independent journalist who, years ago, tried to investigate a multi-million-dollar donation from the Aldridge House to a clinic in Connecticut. He was silenced, called a conspiracy theorist, accused of seeking fame, of invading the royal family's privacy with dubious intentions. But I remembered the article. I'd read it in secret as a teenager, hidden under the sheets just to convince myself it was nonsense. Now, I no longer had that luxury. I arranged to meet him, under another name, neutral location, calculated risk. When Liam arrived, he wasn't surprised to see me. He didn't feign respect or offense. He just looked me in the eyes, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. And maybe he had. "So now you want to know what the princess is hiding," he said with a faint hint of irony. "No," I replied firmly. "I want to know what was hidden from me." That sentence changed everything. In a few words, I stopped being a pawn on the board and became someone ready to flip the table. Liam didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened. And there, at that cold, anonymous table, we began unraveling a thread stitched by powerful, dirty hands, hands that made choices that should never have been made. He showed me old clippings, financial records, copies of confidential files he'd obtained before being barred from royal coverage. And among dates, receipts, and names, there she was again. Eleanor, linked not only to me, but to a woman who vanished 24 years ago, a young woman named Julia Grace Norwood, last recorded at the clinic where Eleanor worked. The woman who gave birth to me. The story was worse than I'd imagined. Julia had been pregnant by a man tied to a rival family, caught in internal political disputes that should never have touched ordinary people. The pregnancy was hidden. The child, me, taken away, and the rest buried, to protect names, to keep the blue blood pure, to feed the lie that now graced magazine covers and state speeches. And as Liam spoke, something in me went quiet, a part that had always screamed to be heard. For the first time, it didn't need to defend itself anymore. It was there. It saw the truth before its own eyes. And even if it cost me everything, I wouldn't return to the shadows, because now I knew, and knowing made me dangerous, but also finally free. The tension in the palace became almost palpable, like electricity in the air before a storm. I spoke less, but observed more. My father's words, always so controlled, so carefully chosen, began to feel too sharp, as if they carried fear disguised as authority. My mother, on the other hand, avoided my eyes. Her gestures grew softer, almost cautious, like someone tiptoeing around a truth that could explode at any moment. By day, I kept up protocol, attended meetings, appeared in cultural campaigns, flashed smiles. But at night, I met with Liam. Always. In different places, far from cameras. Sometimes we barely spoke, just walked side by side, breathing deeply, as if we were unearthing centuries of history with our mere presence. He was different from anything the royal world had ever shown me. He didn't treat me as fragile or untouchable. He didn't idolize me or fear me. He just saw me. Sometimes his gaze said more than any document he uncovered. And one of those nights, as we sat by a lake under a dark sky, in a place where I didn't need to be a princess, he simply asked, "If you had to choose between the crown and the truth, which would you pick?" I took a moment to answer, because the answer wasn't simple. The crown was all I'd ever known. The truth was all I'd never had. "The truth," I whispered, "but not without fighting for what I deserve." Liam didn't reply, but in that moment among the trees and the breeze, he took my hand for the first time. Not like someone claiming, but like someone recognizing, and for the first time, I touched someone without fear of being undone. As our connection grew in secret, the investigation deepened. We discovered that Julia, my biological mother, had been forcibly admitted months after giving birth to me. The records were erased. But Liam found a forgotten footnote in a 1999 lawsuit. She'd been declared mentally unstable by a medical board funded by one of the companies tied to the Aldrich Foundation. She wasn't ill. She was silenced. In that moment, everything clicked. The power, the politics, the so-called honor. All the speeches I'd heard since childhood about destiny and sacrifice were just another form of control, of erasing inconvenient voices. And I was the biggest one of all. Then came the invitation to a public address, a symbolic celebration of my role in the family and the continuity of the royal legacy. I understood immediately what it meant: damage control, a move to silence me before the truth could slip out. I accepted, and in that moment I knew it would be there, before the entire world, that the lie would begin to fall. The days leading up to the address were a silent dance of tension and pretense. On the outside, everything was as usual. The staff prepared the event, newspapers speculated about my dress, my speech, my public intentions. Inside, I counted every second like a countdown to collapse. Matthew, even without knowing everything, noticed. He watched me with a quiet care, like someone who knows something's about to crumble but chooses not to stop it. The night before, I entered my father's office. For the first time, unannounced. He was turned away, reviewing documents. When he sensed my presence, he hesitated for just a second, then regained his composure, as if nothing could throw him off balance. "Celeste, I assume you're ready for." "Tomorrow." "I am," I replied, "but there's something you need to hear first." He raised his eyes, hard, cold, the look of a man who knew exactly what I'd uncovered and feared I'd say it aloud. I faced him. I said Julia's name, Eleanor's name, the hospital, the dates. I showed the photo, the note, and finally, the bracelet with the name I was given before everything was rewritten. "You know, this changes nothing," he said. His voice didn't waver, but his fingers did. "It changes everything," I replied. "It changes who I am." He stood slowly. His mask didn't fall, but it cracked, just enough to reveal the truth always lurking behind that controlled face. "Everything I did was to protect you. No. You molded me to fit, not to be." There was a silence, thick, cruel, and in it, I realized there was nothing more to say between us. Not as father and daughter, just as two sides that had at last revealed themselves. The next day, under the lights, with cameras broadcasting, live to the entire nation, I took my place at the center of the stage. The official speech was printed, reviewed, laminated, a rehearsed piece to maintain order. But I pulled another sheet from my pocket, my own words. And when I began to read, the room stopped. I spoke of history, of identity, of what it's like to be born, raised, and then discover you've lived as a character in a lie. I spoke of Julia, of the stifled truth, of the pain of growing up as the ideal version of something that was never real. I said, the Aldrich house built its image on purchased silences, and that I, there for the first time, wasn't speaking as a princess, but as a woman. As I spoke, I saw my mother lower her eyes. I saw my father clench his fists. I saw advisors exchange panicked glances, but I kept going, until the last word, until the final piece of truth left my mouth with the resolve of someone who no longer accepts living under veils. When I stepped off the stage, security was already mobilizing. The press's questions erupted. The entire nation began to react. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew the most important thing. For the first time, I had chosen myself, and no crown, no name, no legacy was worth more than that. The world didn't collapse all at once. It fell bit by bit. First came the headlines, confused, frenzied, trying to decide if I was a victim or a traitor. Then the official statements from the Aldrich House, carefully worded by lawyers and image strategists. They denied, downplayed, called me emotionally distressed, and insinuated I'd been manipulated. They used words like disinformation, distorted narratives, even identity crisis. I expected it. When you expose a truth buried for so long, the instinct of those who built the tomb is always the same, deny to the end. But the we nation wasn't the same anymore, and neither was I. The backlash was immediate. Part of the population embraced me as a symbol of courage. Another part judged me as ungrateful, as if I'd spat on the golden plate I'd been served. But none of that mattered as much as what was happening inside me. I'd broken the silent pact that had upheld my entire life. And now I was free to discover who I was. Without anyone writing my name for me, I left the palace, voluntarily. I returned the titles, refused the ceremonial salary, left behind the custom dresses, the cameras, the cold engagements that once gave me a sense of purpose. I rented a small apartment in a part of the city never marked on protocol maps. And there, among simple furniture and real windows, I began to live. For the first time, Liam came with me, not as a savior, but as a partner. He knew every piece of my pain, not because he tried to heal it, but because he stayed. Silent when needed, relentless when I needed strength. Together we rediscovered the everyday, cooking, walking hand in hand without security, sleeping without scheduled hours, laughing without thinking of consequences. Of course, there were hard days, moments when the weight of what I'd left behind pulled me like an anchor. I received threatening letters, saw my name dragged through talk shows, was cited as a symbol of the new generation's emotional fragility. But there were also other letters, from girls who said, "You made me believe I can choose myself too." From women who confessed to living decades in roles that never fit them. And that's when I understood. My act wasn't a fall. It was a beginning. A year later, I visited Eleanor again. She was waiting in her garden with cut flowers and trembling hands. She didn't say anything at first, just hugged me, long, tight, as if in that embrace there were no kingdoms or titles, just two women who could finally take their place in the world. My birth mother, and for the first time, I saw myself whole. No brooches, no rehearsed lines, no veils, just Celeste, a woman born twice, once by the hands of a lie and again by the act of choosing her own truth. Sometimes I still wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, as if my soul were still trying to escape a palace that no longer exists. Some echoes linger, even after silence arrives, but today they no longer scare me. They just remind me of where I came from and how much I had to shed of everything they dressed me in to finally breathe with my own lungs. I no longer wear crowns. I carry no titles, nor attend dinners with golden plates. I traded it all for something no one can take from me, my story told by me. Liam and I live in a house with big windows and few rules. He still writes, and so do I. Sometimes together, sometimes in silence, sitting side by side, letting our truths blend with the world outside. We don't seek fame, we seek meaning. Eleanor is now part of my life. It's strange to call her mother after so many years using that word for another woman, but between us, there's no obligation, just affection, deep, slow, and true. As for the Aldrich House, it still stands, like so many institutions that survive at the cost of silence. But something has changed, maybe not in them, but in the people, in those who saw what I did, in those who understood that even the best told stories deserve to be rewritten. Today, I'm not a symbol. I'm not a princess. I'm not a daughter of a system. I'm Celeste, the woman who learned that the truth sets you free, even when it costs everything. And if I could go back and do it all again, I'd choose to fall, just to at last stand on my own 2 feet. The end.